On February 17th, 2004, shoppers inside of a massive Japanese superstore called Jusco in Wakachi City were suddenly aware of a loud commotion. When they went to investigate, they found a thin young woman with a young baby strapped to her chest, grappling with an older man. Initially, onlookers didn't know what to do. They stood there shocked at what they were seeing. Then the woman yelled out, "Thief!" The man she was fighting with was in his late 60s, and he had pinned the woman and her baby up against this bank of ATMs, and his fists were clenched like he was holding whatever it was he took from her. 3 men from the crowd immediately jumped into action and wrestled the man off of the woman and pinned him to the ground and began trying to pull his hands open to take out whatever he had stolen from this woman, but the man would not unclench his fists. And so these 3 men yelled out to the police that happened to be nearby. They ran over and jumped on top of this guy and handcuffed him, and the man, as he's laying on the ground, is yelling out that he did nothing wrong, and then onlookers would say he began moaning very strangely before he began violently vomiting before falling unconscious. While the police waited for emergency services to show up and take this man to the hospital, they were able to open up his fists and discovered the only thing he was clutching was his own bank card that was now bent in 3 places. The wallet he had on him belonged to him, and the bags that were lying on the ground all around him only contained some pet supplies that he had recently purchased. It did not appear he had actually taken anything from this woman. And speaking of this woman, the police were so caught up in the chaos of the moment that they hadn't even thought to look around for the victim to see if she was okay. So they poked their heads up and start looking around the crowd for this woman, but she's nowhere to be seen. And so they asked the crowd, do we know who she is or where she went? And nobody knew. The police did think it was odd that this woman had walked off without talking to them first, but they figured if she walked away, then everything must be fine. And so they labeled the incident an attempted robbery and they closed the case. The following day, the older man, who became known as Mr. A by police, died at the hospital as a result of heart failure caused by extreme stress. When the police found out about this, they simply went into the case file, updated it to show the suspect had died, and did not investigate further. But Mr. A's family refused to believe he had just attacked a young woman and her baby. It was completely out of character. He was a gentle retiree who had spent 40 years working for a chemical manufacturer and now was collecting a pension and working part-time as a security guard. He lived with his wife, his children, and his grandchildren, and he lived about a kilometer away from the Jusco where he had gone that day to get some hamster food for his grandson's hamster. His family pleaded with police to reopen the case and investigate this woman because she must have done something to start this altercation. The police initially resisted, but ultimately conceded and said, okay, we'll check the CCTV camera footage at the Jusco to make sure we didn't miss anything. And what they discovered terrified them. A camera overlooking the ATM bank where this whole scuffle went down picked up this woman about 5 minutes before Mr. A walked into frame. She was standing in a corner just off to the side of the ATMs, and she did appear to have a 2-year-old or 1-year-old strapped to her chest, and she was just standing there motionless with her back to the corner looking down. And then when Mr. A came into frame, he appeared to pull some money out of the ATM. He had bags all over his arms. He turned around after getting his cash and started walking away. And as soon as he does, the woman in the corner suddenly becomes animated. She lifts her head up and walks straight past him, skimming his chest with her hand as she passed. And right after she did that, it was like Mr. A had a reaction to being touched by her, and he instinctively grabbed her arm, and that's when the struggle ensued, and that's when the woman yelled out "thief," although it's clear from the footage that she is the aggressor, not Mr. A. And then at some point, the 3 men jump out of the crowd, they pull him to the ground, the police show up, and then at some point during this chaotic melee, the woman just stands up and meanders her way into the crowd and disappears. Although the police searched every piece of footage in and around this ATM all around the time of the incident, they never found any footage of this woman entering or exiting the Jusco. It was like she just appeared in that corner in order to go after Mr. A and then vanished as soon as it was done. And none of the dozens of witnesses that watched the scuffle take place right in front of them in broad daylight were able to provide any sort of meaningful description of this woman. It was like nobody got a really good look at her. But after reviewing hours and hours of the CCTV footage, the police did find one instance where this woman, for 1 second, looked up at a camera exposing her face. And her face was so unsettling to police that they actually decided not to share the image with the public for an entire year. They were scared that if people saw this image, it would scare them from ever going back to Jusco. This is the image of the woman. As you can see, her face is totally emotionless, her eyes are blank and downcast. Some have compared her face to a death mask, which is a plaster cast of a dead person's face. Other people have said she doesn't even look human. After seeing the CCTV footage, Mr. A's relatives sued the police for detaining him and pinning him to the ground despite his obvious medical distress as a result of whatever this woman did to him. Eventually, they did reach a settlement, but what they really wanted was an explanation for who this woman was. But even after the police released this strange photo to the public, nobody ever came forward, so she was never identified. And it's unlikely she'll ever be identified because the statute of limitations for this case expired in 2011. The case, which is now referred to as the Jusko Phantom, is still very famous in Japan, and it remains a popular topic on long internet chat room threads where people exchange this eerie photograph and speculate about who or what killed Mr. A. In 2010, Sam Ballard was a 19-year-old living in Australia. He was a college student and a standout rugby player. His mother described him as being invincible. One night, Sam and his buddies were over a friend's house having what they called a red wine appreciation night, where they sarcastically pretend to be grown-ups by only drinking wine instead of beer. And after hours of drinking and joking around, they were standing in the backyard on the patio when they noticed a small slug crawling across the ground. And at some point, one of the boys yelled out, "Hey, someone should eat that!" But no one was taking him seriously, and everyone just kind of joked about it. But Sam took it as a challenge and said, "You know what? I'll eat the slug." And everyone's like, "No way, you're not going to eat that slug." But them telling him he wasn't going to do it only egged him on, and so he picked that slug up, threw it in his mouth, and he ate it. And the boys howled with laughter. They were so impressed, and for the rest of the night, he was the king. The next morning when Sam got up, he noticed a dull ache in his legs. He attributed the pain to his hangover and expected it to clear by the evening. But by the end of the day, the fog of his hangover had gone away, but the pain in his legs had not. The following day, when he woke up, the pain was not only still there, it had intensified. And so he told his mother about it, and her first concern was that he could be developing multiple sclerosis, something his dad had. Sam was concerned about that too, but he also told her that he had eaten this slug, and he was concerned that, maybe this could be some sort of allergic reaction to that. And his mother said, "You know what, you got nothing to worry about with the slug. Nobody gets sick from things like that." So they went to the doctor, and multiple sclerosis was very quickly ruled out, which was a huge relief to the Ballards. But the doctor said they didn't really have a good reason for why Sam was experiencing this leg pain. Sam brought up the fact that he had eaten this slug, and even though his mom didn't think it was a big deal, he was wondering if maybe this could be an allergic reaction. And the doctor said that off the top of their head, they had no idea if the slug had anything to do with this leg pain. But a couple of days later, the doctor called Sam back and said they had had a chance to do some research, and they spoke to their colleagues, and it looks like Sam had something called rat lungworm disease. This is an infection most commonly found in rats that's caused by a parasitic worm that can be passed down to snails and slugs if they eat the rat feces that contains the parasite's larva. Based on Sam's symptoms, which now included persistent dizziness and vomiting, the doctor informed him that most likely the slug he consumed at that party was a carrier of the parasite. The doctor informed the Ballards that most people who contract rat lungworm disease do so from eating undercooked or raw snails, and they recover without incident once the parasite dies. But in very rare cases, the parasite can penetrate the intestine, traverse the nervous system, and then burrow itself into the outer lining of the brain, causing patients to suffer from a very rare form of meningitis that can be deadly. Sam and his family were told there wasn't much anybody could do to help treat his symptoms, and so all they could really do was just wait to see how severe his case was going to be. And unfortunately, Sam's was extremely severe. Just a few days after his diagnosis, Sam did develop the rare form of meningitis, and he slipped into a coma for 420 days. When he finally woke up, he was paralyzed, he wasn't able to speak, and he couldn't eat without a feeding tube. He required care 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But the disease did not affect his mental faculties. He was just as sharp as ever. One of his best friends, Jimmy Galvin, who was there the night Sam ate the slug, said he went into Sam's room after he came out of this coma, and he told Sam how sorry he was that he didn't try to stop him from eating the slug. And although Sam couldn't speak or react in any way, he cried because clearly he had understood what Jimmy had told him. Sam was eventually released from the hospital in a motorized wheelchair 3 years after being admitted. He would only live another 5 years before the infection claimed his life. Sam kept a copy of the Dr. Seuss book, Oh, the Places You'll Go, close to him over the 8 years following his diagnosis. The book was Dr. Seuss's final salute, offering encouragement to children as they deal with life's inevitable obstacles. Over the years, as he struggled with his severe disabilities, his friends and family would read from this book, willing him to make the best of the challenges he was facing. And then as his friends and family said their final goodbye at his funeral, the book was read one last time. When Conrad Rowland was a little kid, he was always on the go. One time when he was at the grocery store with his mother, he leapt out of the cart and ran away from her, and she found him stuck inside of a freezer. After that incident, she literally made him wear bells on his shoes when they were out in public so she didn't lose track of him. But by the time Conrad was just 4 years old, he had discovered athletics. And instead of putting his energy into running away from his mom, he focused it exclusively on baseball, basketball, soccer, and tennis. And by the time he was 11 years old, he was an exceptional all-around athlete. And at the time, his school announced they were going to have this special guest speaker at an assembly, and it turned out to be the Hall of Fame baseball player Rod Carew. And Conrad was just blown away. He just could not believe he was in the presence of an actual professional athlete, let alone a guy that had achieved the success Rod Carew had. And so after this assembly, when he got home, it was all Conrad could talk about, was just how incredible Mr. Carew was, and how he, Conrad, was gonna be a professional athlete just like Mr. Carew. For many kids, this would just be a phase. They'd be really invested in sports, and then their interest would go somewhere else, and they'd kind of forget about it, and it would not be their life calling anymore. But for Conrad, the impression Rod Carew left on him was so profound that he never wavered. He really did dedicate himself to becoming a professional athlete, and he would be successful. Albeit in a different sport, he became a professional football player in the NFL. And in 2012, Conrad started nearly every game for the New York Jets at tight end. It was like his professional career was going off without a hitch. But in 2013, he injured his knee, which sidelined him for about 2 years. And even though he diligently rehabbed and got back to full strength, the teams were not really ready to take a flyer on him because they were worried his knee would just give out again. He continued to train extremely hard in hopes of landing another contract, but his playing career was starting to look bleak. During the 2016 offseason, Conrad was back home in California visiting his family. One night, as his mother, Mary, was making dinner, Conrad was sitting at the table filling out his driver's license renewal form. And when he got to the section where it asked him if he wanted to be an organ donor, he stopped and he asked his mother, are you an organ donor? And she would say, yeah, I am. And so Conrad said, okay, then I will be too. And he checked the box. And Mary remembers thinking, gosh, I really hope it never comes to that. A few months later, Conrad was working out in a local gym getting ready for the next season when he developed a sudden and severely painful headache. He tried to keep working out, but he just could not do it. So he stepped aside and he called his mom and he told her that he felt this weird click in his head and then he felt this blinding pain behind his left eye. His mother told him he needed to go to the hospital right away. And so that day, Conrad went over to the UCLA Medical Center where they quickly diagnosed him with a brain aneurysm. A brain aneurysm is the bulging or ballooning of a blood vessel in the brain. If the aneurysm bursts, it's fatal about 50% of the time. And for the people who survive a ruptured aneurysm, most likely they will suffer from significant neurological deficits. After his diagnosis, Conrad remained positive and assured his family he was going to kick this thing's butt. But on December 12th, just 4 days after he was admitted, Conrad's aneurysm burst and he never regained consciousness. Because Conrad was an organ donor, the doctors kept his body on life support and they called the recipients at the top of the donor lists. One of them was a man in his 70s who a year earlier had suffered a massive heart attack and desperately needed a new heart. When he and his wife got the call, they were shaking. They couldn't believe it. His life was about to be saved. They already lived right near Los Angeles, so they hopped in their car and they sped to the UCLA Medical Center, and shortly thereafter, news out of the operating room was the transplant had been a success. The man Conrad's heart had just saved was none other than Baseball Hall of Famer Rod Carew, Conrad's childhood hero that had pushed him to become a professional athlete. At first, the families had no idea, but eventually this incredible link was discovered and immediately the two families bonded. Today, because Conrad's family only lives 12 miles away from Rod Carew and his family, Conrad's mother was given a standing invitation by the Carews to stop by anytime she wanted to listen to her son's heart. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please get a job at the Like Button's favorite Starbucks just so you can give them a severely burnt coffee every morning. In China, there are hundreds of these protected areas where Siberian tigers are raised. And in some of these areas, parks have been created so locals and tourists can visit the animals. One of these parks is the Battling Wildlife World Animal Park, which in addition to allowing its guests to come and look at the animals, they actually allow their guests to hop in their personal cars and drive all around the tiger enclosure completely unsupervised. Despite the almost non-existent security, the park does have one hard and fast rule, and that is at no point during the drive-through tour should anyone ever get out of their car or roll their window down. In the summer of 2016, a husband, a wife, their young daughter, and the girl's grandmother decided to go to Battling Park. After paying for an unguided tour, they opened the gates and the family rolled into the tiger enclosure inside of their white sedan. Everyone seemed to be having a great time until the wife in the front passenger seat claimed she was carsick. And so the husband slowed the car down to a complete stop, and then the wife promptly got out of the car. What happens in the next 30 seconds is captured in one of the park's security cameras that was trained right down at the front of the car. After getting out, the woman shuts her door and walks around the front of the car until she's right in front of the driver's side door. She leans in to talk to her husband, and as soon as she does, a Siberian tiger comes running out of the forest off camera, lunges towards the car, grabs onto her, and pulls her off camera back into the forest. The husband immediately leaps out of the car, and he hesitates for a second because the grandmother has now opened the back door and she's jumped out as well. And so once they're both on the pavement, they shut their doors behind them and the two of them run off into the forest. Off camera, a gruesome scene would unfold. As soon as the husband and grandmother ran off into the woods, a second Siberian tiger that might have been drawn to the scene from the commotion or the smell of blood immediately leapt out and latched onto the grandmother, killing her instantly. The wife would survive the attack, but would suffer very serious injuries. As for the husband, he would escape with minor injuries, and the child who stayed in the car was totally unharmed. Following the high-profile attack, the Battling Park was forced to put up more signage on either end of this driving tour to make it very clear to anybody going through that they had to stay in their car with the windows up the entire time. Saying that she wasn't properly warned about the dangers of this park, the woman who survived the attack, the wife who was dragged off initially, she sued the park for $2 million US. In the wake of the accident, she claims a culture of rampant victim blaming has ruined her life. She's quoted as saying, "People's words were perhaps scarier than the mouth of a tiger." 63-year-old Kurt Kaiser was a farmer who had a knack for finding clever ways to keep his machinery up and running on his 1,500-acre hog farm in Nebraska. In the winter of 2019, when the ground was frozen solid, Kurt was having a hard time putting his fill bin underneath his grain auger, and so he did what he did best. He improvised. A grain auger is this large rotating metal screw that transports grain from one place to another. And so the way this works is, imagine this big tube where in the middle of it is this big rotating metal screw. And so the grain gets sucked in on one side, it rotates its way all the way through to the other end of the auger, and it's spit out the other. Because the auger is basically a giant rotating blade and the entry point is actually exposed, there's this big safety grate that's on the outside to make sure the only things getting sucked into the auger are really small, things like grain. Kurt realized if he removed the safety screen, he could easily fit the fill bin underneath. And so he did that, and he told himself that he would just replace the safety screen as soon as he was done. But it turned out, once that safety screen was gone, the machine actually worked a lot better. And after a couple of days of operating the auger without the screen, he just kind of forgot about it. Fast forward a few months to April 19th, 2019, and Kurt needed to move some grain from one bin to another. And so he fired up the auger that still did not have the safety screen on the outside of it. And as he was walking right near the entrance to the auger, he tripped and he fell feet first into the opening of the auger. And right away, his left foot got sucked up into the rotating metal screw. And before he'd even fallen back onto the ground, he could tell his left foot had been cut clean off. But that wasn't the worst of it, because the rest of his leg was still getting pulled into the shaft. That screw was going to keep on turning and he could not get to the turn-off switch. And so he immediately starts fumbling for his phone and he realizes he doesn't have it on him. He left it in the shed. And so he's got no way to call anyone. There's no one anywhere near him. No one's going to hear him scream. And so Kurt's looking around wondering what he's going to do as he can feel himself being pulled closer and closer to the machine. But in that moment, the adrenaline was so high for Kurt that he felt no pain. He only had one thought: survive. Kurt realized he had his pocket knife. He always carried it with him. He pulled it out. It was a 4-inch blade, and he realized he could cut his leg off. But he had to time it right. If he didn't cut through fast enough, the auger would rotate all the way around and would pull more of his leg, the area he was cutting, into the auger. So he'd have to start all over again. And so he watched the rotating screw until he could clearly see a break in his leg, and he timed it so he reached down and cut through his leg as fast as he could right before the rotation of the auger caught up again. And as soon as he cut through, he fell backwards, rolled onto his stomach, and began army crawling all the way 200 meters back to his shed, where he pulled himself up inside, he got his phone, and he called his son, and he very calmly told him that he had his leg cut off in the auger. Kurt was soon airlifted to a hospital where doctors were able to perform a real amputation on him. For a little while after his accident, Kurt was a celebrity. He was all over the news. But apparently, he just did not care at all about that. All he wanted to do was put a prosthetic on and go back to work. And sure enough, only a few weeks after having his leg ripped off by an auger, he was back out working on an auger with a prosthetic leg. On September 29th, 2015, a tropical storm named Joaquin was swirling off in the Atlantic, and forecasters were having a hard time determining how big it was going to be, how fast it was going to be, and where it was going to end up. On shore, 53-year-old Captain Michael Davidson was struggling too. He was supposed to pilot his enormous cargo ship, the El Faro, from where he was in Florida all the way out to Puerto Rico, a 2,600-mile journey that would put he and the rest of his 32-person crew directly in the path of this storm. The year before, Davidson had been passed over for a promotion for a younger, more tech-savvy captain, and so now Davidson felt like he had something to prove. As he looked out over the calm water and the clear sky, he made a fateful decision. Every agency out there was telling him to not set sail until the storm had passed. But with 37 years of experience, Davidson felt differently. He felt like he could outrun this storm. Feeling suddenly motivated and confident, Davidson boarded the El Faro, hopped on the intercom, and informed his crew that they would not be waiting out the storm. Instead, they would be sailing right by it. As El Faro cast off her lines and headed southward, the governors of New Jersey, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Maryland all declared states of emergency. As the sound of El Faro's diesel engine faded over the horizon, cyclone warnings and hurricane warnings went up around the Bahamas. Schools on the islands began closing, flights were grounded, and cruise ships were diverted. Residents of one island were ordered to evacuate, and on another, police forcibly removed every occupant on this island as floodwater rose. But the first few hours of El Faro's journey were totally uneventful. But as they got closer and closer to the storm, the wind picked up and the waves grew dramatically. By nightfall, the ship was rocking so aggressively side to side that it made sleep almost impossible. By the following morning, the rain was so intense, the visibility was basically zero, and the waves were now so massive that none of the crew dared go out on the deck in fear of being swept overboard. The ship's navigator told Captain Davidson that he thought this storm was a lot worse than they were expecting, and that they should really consider turning around before it was too late. Davidson and the navigator were not the only ones up on the bridge, which is where the ship is actually steered from. There was also a black box that was anchored up on the wall behind them that recorded all of the conversations that happened up there. And the black box would record increasingly anxious conversations between the crew and Davidson as they voiced their concerns about the storm. But Davidson was totally unfazed. He was adamant that the storm was not going to get any worse than what they were seeing right then and there. And even if it did get worse, they were never going to be actually in the storm's eye, and so they weren't in any real danger. But to reassure his crew, he ordered his navigator to make a slight right so everybody on board saw they were taking a wider berth around the storm. One of the crew members, a 34-year-old woman named Danielle Randolph, was not reassured by this slight right. She was a hard worker from a military family and always followed orders, but she just could not understand why Davidson was not taking the storm seriously. And so that evening, after the sun had set, Danielle very carefully stumbled her way up the stairs to the navigational bridge because the ship is still rocking violently side to side. And when she got up there, she thought she would just check the weather for herself. The black box anchored to the wall recorded her discovery. The El Faro was not going to sidestep the storm. It was sailing directly into it. You can hear the fear and surprise as Danielle turns to Davidson and says, "We're sailing right through the eye." There was a silence on the recording as Davidson must have looked down at the computer screen that Danielle had pulled up to show him the storm and their course that was going right into it. And Davidson, after he realized his mistake, has this very eerily calm tone where he says to the navigator, "Okay, I need you to make another slight right." And he assured everybody on the bridge that that would be enough, that that would fix this mistake. But Danielle was not buying it. And so as professionally and respectfully as she could, she says to her captain, "This is a really bad idea. We really need to turn around right now. It's getting to the point where it's going to be too late and we won't be able to turn around. But Davidson wasn't having it. And so he told Danielle and the navigator and the other people on the bridge that they were not in danger, that everything's just fine. This is just like the storms he had been through when he used to work in Alaska, and they would get through this one too. Davidson was so confident in his decision making that he told them he was going to go take a nap downstairs, and if they really needed him, if something serious happened, go and get him. And with that, he left the bridge and went down to his room. As the minutes of the night ticked by, Danielle stayed up in the bridge and she braced herself against a steel girder and looked out the window at the rain that was just slashing across the window and the waves that were the size of 3-story houses crashing in on either side of them. And then by the morning, when the sun came up, the sky just stayed totally black because they were right outside the eye of the storm. Suddenly, under their feet, Danielle and the navigator and the other people up on the bridge heard this awful clanging metal sound as the constant rocking of the ship had finally loosened up the straps holding down these massive metal containers down in the cargo hold, and they were now loose, smashing into the inside of the ship. And then they heard an even worse sound, and the black box recorded it too. And that was the shrill of an alarm that meant Alfaro was taking on water. Danielle left the window and ran around to the radar screen to see if there was any ships in the area that might be able to help them. But when she looked, there was no blips on the screen. All the other ships had diverted to avoid this storm. Alfaro was totally alone. At the sound of the alarm, Davidson came running back up to the bridge, and you hear him on the black box, and he sounds like someone who's acting calm, but there's a tightness in his voice that he's trying to conceal the fact that he's actually probably quite scared. Because at this point, the reality was the Alfaro was now too close to the eye of the storm, and they would be unable to escape its grasp. They were going to get pulled into the eye of this hurricane. Furious with her captain, she brushed past him without saying anything and then very carefully made her way down the stairs to her room. And the whole time she was walking, she would have been barely able to stand because now with those loose shipping containers down in the cargo hold, the ship would rock even farther to each side because as soon as it tilted one way, the containers would slam into the wall, driving it even farther into the water. When she finally staggered her way down and got to her door, she would have opened it up and her whole room would have been trashed. Everything that wasn't anchored down had been tossed all over the room, all of her clothes, any furniture would have been dumped all over the room. But she didn't care about any of her stuff on the ground. She only wanted her laptop. She found it. It was on the ground. She picked it up. She put it on her desk that was bolted down. And very carefully, she opened it up and she opened her email. As the alarms are shrieking in the background and she can hear the sound of these shipping containers smashing into the inside of the cargo hold, she writes this note to her mother where she tells her the winds are really bad and it looks like they're sailing right for the center of this storm. And she's about to hit send when she stops for a second. She looks at her computer screen and she adds one more line. Love to everyone. Danielle never said things like this. She was always strictly business. And so for her to put that line was an acknowledgement that this might be the last time she ever talks to her family. Shortly after Danielle hit send on that email, the ship listed hard to one side and then it stayed there. The loose containers down in the cargo hold had finally shifted the ship's center of gravity. Water immediately began pouring into the lower sections of Alfaro. Danielle knew it was only a matter of time before the water reached her, and so she leapt out of her room and ran down the hall, which was now sideways. She got to the stairwell and climbed her way up to the bridge. As soon as she got up there, all the people on the bridge were holding onto the center console so they didn't fall up against the wall, and she heard Davidson ordering the navigator to turn the ship into the wind. It was a last-ditch Hail Mary effort where Davidson believed the wind was so strong it would blow the ship back upright. If this didn't work, the ship was going to sink. And so the navigator began desperately turning the wheel, the lights inside of the bridge began to flicker, and the engines growled and vibrated as it churned, trying desperately to get up and over this enormous wave. But as they were just about to crest the top, the engines completely died and it went silent in the bridge. And so now that Alfaro is without power, it's just sitting idle in the middle of the storm and it's getting smashed by these 3-story high waves, and it begins to force the nose of this giant ship to go under and stay under. Davidson breaks the silence by hitting the emergency beacon that notifies the Coast Guard, and then he screams to everybody on the bridge to go downstairs and wake everyone up. We have to get off this ship. On the black box, a new sound is heard, the abandoned ship alarm. At this point, the black box faintly picks up Davidson screaming from somewhere outside of the bridge for people to get in their rafts, get off the boat, get in the water. By this point, the back of the Alfaro would have been off the water and the nose would have been almost pointed straight down. down. And so Davidson is heard coming back up into the bridge, but at this point, the bridge is sideways. It's looking straight down at the water. And it's clear there is another crew member that is stuck inside of the bridge, and he's yelling out to Davidson, Cap, you gotta help me. And Davidson is trying to find him, and he's yelling for him to come to him. And the man tells him he's stuck, he can't go anywhere, he's a goner. And Davidson, with the final words uttered on this black box, would yell to this man, I'm not leaving you, it's time to come this way. And then the black box would cut out because the black box was now underwater. For 3 days, searchers could not even get close to the El Faro wreckage because of the storm. But when they did finally get there, all they could find were 3 life rings, 2 life rafts, and the starboard lifeboat that had been crushed on both sides. A Coast Guard helicopter found a body floating around some of this wreckage, but when they went down to retrieve it, it slipped under the water. 5 days after El Faro's last frantic plea for help, the Coast Guard declared the ship had sunk and everyone on board had died. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please raise the like button's office chair all the way to the top Canadian-USA border that combined make up the famous Niagara Falls. They have a max height of about 170 feet at their highest point, and every second, 700,000 gallons of water tumbles over the edge. The rapids above the falls are some of the strongest and most violent in the world, with a max speed of about 40 miles per hour right before you hit the edge. As a result, no one's allowed to boat or swim in the final 3.2 miles of the Niagara River that feeds into the falls. But back in the day, there was no such restriction. On the evening of July 16th, 1853, 3 men were working on a small barge anchored in the Niagara River about a half-mile away from the edge of the falls. Once they were done with work, the way they would get back to shore is by taking a rowboat and taking it downstream to the small island called Goat Island that sits right on the edge of the falls. Now, in order to get to that island, you would have to traverse the rapids. But it was only a couple hundred feet away, and because they worked here all the time, they had traversed the rapids many times before without incident. But this time, as soon as they got in, one of their oars broke. And so they weren't able to control their boat, and very quickly they got dragged into the rapids, started getting spun around, and then it capsized. Although they desperately tried to swim to shore, the rapids were just too strong, and 2 of the men were swept away to their death. But one man, Joseph Avery, was lucky enough that when he fell in, he drifted down and grabbed onto this tree root that was sticking out of the water. And so he pulled himself about halfway up out of the water, he caught his breath, and he's looking around, and he can't believe he survived. But he wasn't out of the water yet, so to speak, because he was in the middle of these rapids and there was nobody on shore. It was getting late. His 2 buddies have drowned, and when he yelled out, the rapids were so loud nobody could hear him. And the log he was holding onto was totally slick, and so he had to grip it as hard as he could, otherwise he would just slip back into the water. And so all night, with half of his body in the water, he gripped onto this branch as tight as he could and just prayed he would survive. The next morning, when tourists arrived, they noticed Joseph out on this log and they waved to him. And Joseph, who had used all his strength just to hold onto this log all night, was not only fatigued, but also was becoming hypothermic. And he very carefully removed one hand and he waved back. The tourists immediately notified authorities and a rescue effort was launched. And because it was too dangerous to take a boat and try to drive down to Avery and pull him out that way because he was right near the edge of the falls, what they did is they went up to this little bridge that was upstream of Joseph and they released rafts and small boats, hoping that one of them, just by chance, would get caught up on that log and he could grab it, and then Joseph could climb in, throw the rope out, and get pulled to shore. But unfortunately, after dozens of attempts, nothing came close to Joseph. Their next plan was to tie a long tether onto one boat and then guide it down the river until it reached Joseph. And this worked. But when Joseph climbed into the boat, it immediately began to capsize. And witnesses would say Joseph stood up, and as he was falling backwards, he threw his hands up in the air like he was surrendering. He let out a final scream and then fell under the turbulent waters. And then seconds later, he was swept off the falls to his death. Here is the final photo of Joseph Avery. It was taken by a journalist right before that boat with a tether attached to it arrived in front of him. Chad Lawhorn woke up in his Nashville home around 3 a.m. on April 8th, 2018. He had taken a long flight back from San Francisco the night before, so his sleep schedule was all messed up. Not feeling very tired, he decided to go downstairs to the kitchen to get a snack. And as he was walking down the stairs, he pulled out his phone and he saw a notification from his Venmo account. His younger brother, Casey, had sent him $250, and attached to it was a single word note. It just said, damages. Knowing his brother had long struggled with his mental health, Chad was concerned he was was getting ready to hurt himself, and he had sent him this money as a way to compensate for the emotional toll he was about to inflict on him. Chad didn't even change out of his pajamas. He grabbed his keys, hopped in his car, and began driving the 2 hours to East Ridge, Tennessee, where his younger brother and his mother lived. On the ride there, he called both of them dozens of times, but he never got through. When he finally pulled onto their street, he looked down the road and he saw dozens of police cars and TV crews, and there was yellow crime scene tape all around their property. Chad just stopped the car right in the middle of the road and just stared. And he didn't know how long he was there for, but at some point, one of the police officers noticed him and walked up and knocked on his window. And when the officer found out who he was talking to, the news Chad was delivered was far worse than anything he was expecting. 24 hours earlier, Chad's younger brother, Casey, who was 23, was spending the day with one of his very good friends named Avery. They had gone to a comic book store to play Magic the Gathering, and then afterwards they headed back to Casey's house to go to bed. Around 12:30 in the morning, Avery fell asleep on the living room floor, and as Casey was getting ready to go to bed himself, his mother called him and asked if he could come pick her up at the bar. And so Casey begrudgingly agreed to do it. He drove to pick her up, and when he saw her, he could tell she was totally intoxicated. And the entire ride home, she just pleaded with Casey not to hurt himself because it would totally devastate her if he ever did that. Casey hated when she talked to him that way, and apparently she did this all the time. When they got back to the house, Casey dropped his mom off, and then he went up to his bedroom where he retrieved a rifle he had stolen from a friend. And then he paced around his room for a while, getting mentally prepared for what he was about to do. And when he felt ready, he left his room, he went downstairs to the living room where Avery was still asleep on the ground, and he placed the rifle up against the side of his head, and he fired one shot, killing his friend instantly. Once he was dead, Casey went upstairs to his mother's room. When he got to the threshold of her room, he pushed the door open and it was totally dark, but he could tell his mother was still awake in her bed. He raised his rifle and he fired, except the gun didn't go off. It jammed. His mother, because she was so intoxicated, did not hear the shot ring out, and she didn't really know what her son was doing in the doorway, so she did not raise any alarms. And so Casey just turned around, walked into the hallway where there was light, he fixed the jam in his gun, he turned back around, and this time his mother was now out of bed because the family dog was barking like mad, and so his mother was trying to calm the dog down, and she looked up and saw her son standing in the doorway carrying a gun, and so she just kind of froze and stared at him, and that's when Casey, without any hesitation, raises his rifle and fires 2 shots, and then his gun jams again. Now, neither of those 2 shots were fatal, although one of them did strike her in the arm. And even though she was intoxicated, she was now fully aware her son is trying to kill her. And so she's screaming at him, "Why are you doing this? You're killing me!" Casey was totally unfazed. He flipped on the lights, he fixed the jam, he re-aimed at his mother, and his mother, who was still just standing next to the bed, looking at her son, wondering why this was happening, and Casey just aimed and took 2 shots, and these would be fatal. After that, he went downstairs and robbed Avery, and then he hopped in his car and he drove all the way to Mississippi, where within 24 hours, he would take his own life. We know all of these details because shortly after he committed these crimes, Casey posted a lengthy confession to Facebook detailing exactly what happened and what he did. This is a screenshot of the actual post. It's extremely graphic and it's since been removed from the social media platform. In his post, Casey says he feels extremely bad for his older brother Chad because he knows this is going to be extremely hard for him, and he encourages people to help his brother during this insanely difficult time. While he doesn't provide a specific motive for why he committed these crimes, he does say at the end of his confession that he's been thinking about murder a lot lately and wanted to know how it felt. But after doing it, he says he barely felt anything at all. In 1996, 28-year-old Paljor Tawang was offered the opportunity of a lifetime. Born and raised in a valley at the foot of the Himalayas, he was chosen to lead the first ever Indian ascent of the north face of the highest peak in the world, Mount Everest. He had left school after the 10th grade and joined the highly competitive and prestigious Indo-Tibetan Border Police. Created in 1962 in response to their domineering neighbor, China, the Border Police specialized in high-altitude landscapes. They had to, given that the boundary between India and China ran through the very rugged Himalayan mountain range. 12 years after joining the Border Police, Paljor was an expert climber and very well liked by his peers, making him an obvious candidate for one of the Border Police's most ambitious missions to date. While While Paljor's mother was full of pride for her son's work and accomplishments, he didn't think she would be very supportive if she knew how dangerous the mission he was going on was. And so he told her he was climbing a different mountain, although she would find out through friends where he was actually going, and she would plead with him not to go, but Paljor was not about to change his mind. He was excited and he was confident. In May of that year, Paljor said bye to his family, and he and the other hikers set out on their journey. At first, it went extremely well. The weather was perfect, and the men seemed to be having an excellent time. But their luck would not hold. The team's final assault on the north face of Mount Everest was marked by mistakes, bad decisions, and very bad weather. According to the official report on the ascent, those problems started on the morning of May 10th when Paljor and the other 3 climbers woke up late. Instead of leaving base camp at 3:30 a.m. like they were planning to, they didn't leave until 8 a.m., so 4.5 hours late. Making matters worse, the weather continued to deteriorate with a blizzard moving in, creating near zero visibility. But even under the best of circumstances, Mount Everest is still a force of nature. The summit may be covered in colorful ropes and flags and climbers with their high-tech, shiny, beautiful gear, accompanied by a small army of Sherpas, but the outward appearance of commercialization is deceptive. Since 1924, at least 300 people have died on Mount Everest. The death-to-summit ratio is a staggering 4%. The extremely high altitude Everest reaches 5.5 miles into the sky not only makes physical exertion extremely difficult, it affects your judgment and decision making, and not in a good way. Climbers and scientists have a name for the final half mile of Mount Everest. It's called the death zone because literally while you're up there, you're dying. Oxygen is so limited up there that your cells just begin to die, and extremely fit people will have heart attacks and strokes and experience debilitating altitude sickness. The conditions are so severe that people have died from exhaustion just standing in line waiting to reach the summit. But one of the biggest killers in the death zone is something called summit fever. When you get to that point in the climb, you are so close to reaching your goal. People will disregard safety and keep going on when really they should turn around and go back. Paljor and his 3 teammates were given strict orders to turn around at 3 p.m. if they had not reached the summit yet. But because of their late start, when 3 p.m. rolled around, they were not at the summit, they were in the death zone. One of the climbers who was with Paljor was the commander. And so at 3 p.m., when they were supposed to stop and turn around, he was at the very back of the climbing stack. And so he stopped and he yelled up to Paljor and the others and tried to get them to stop too so they could go back down, but either they didn't hear him or they just ignored him. Already suffering from frostbite and totally exhausted, he could not go any farther, so he grabbed his radio and he tried to hail them to tell them to stop and come back, but they didn't pick up their radio. And so the commander, after waiting for a few minutes, knew he had to go back down, and so he turned and began the descent. About 30 minutes later, the commander's radio crackled on again, and it was Paljor and the others, and they were informing him that they were going to make a push for the summit. They were about an hour away. And the commander said, "Stop, turn around, I'm ordering you to come back down. The weather is only getting worse." But whether they were suffering from summit fever or overconfidence, we don't know. But regardless, they refused. Frustrated and terrified for the other climbers, the commander just continued down the mountain. But 2.5 hours later, his radio crackled again, and this time it was Paljor and the others saying they had made it. They were standing on the summit of Mount Everest. The men had not just set a record for India, they had brought immeasurable honor to their country. The news sparked a huge celebration down in the base camp and also in the city of Leh, which is where the border police were located. But the party atmosphere would not last long. Shortly after the victory call, the weather turned from bad to horrible. What would later be known as the blizzard of 1996 had arrived in full fury, and by midnight that night, no one had heard from Paljol or the other 2 people he was with. And just a couple of days later, rescue climbers would confirm all 3 men had died. In the years following Paljol's death on the north base of Mount Everest, this hopeful and proud young Indian has become a sort of gruesome celebrity and landmark for the thousands of climbers that make it up into the death zone. Except now he's widely known on the internet and amongst people who are passionate about climbing the world's highest peak, not as Paljor, one of the first Indians to climb the north base of Mount Everest, but as Green Boots, which is a reference to the bright neon green boots he was wearing when he died. For more than 20 years, he's laid near the top of Mount Everest in a small limestone cave, wearing an orange parka and blue pants, and he's curled on his side with his arms wrapped around him like he's trying to keep himself warm. Since his death, anyone climbing the north face when the snow cover is light would literally have to step over his body to get to the top. But Paljor is not the only dead body on Mount Everest. There are over 200 other dead climbers littering the slopes of the world's highest peak. It's just too dangerous and too expensive to try to get them down, and so they stay wherever they died. which means if you climb Mount Everest, you will literally be climbing over dead bodies on your way to the summit. But of all the bodies on Mount Everest, the most famous by far is Paljor. Here is an image of Paljor, aka Green Boots. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please build up the like button's self-confidence and convince them to run for student body president. Help them with their speech, help them hand out flyers, and then on the big day, don't vote for them. On December 17th, 1903, the Wright brothers successfully flew the world's first motor-operated airplane. By 1910, airplanes had improved to the point where they were considered a reasonable form of travel, and so people began focusing on how to make them safer. One big safety concern with airplanes at the time was there was no parachute small enough or light enough to be taken on board with passengers. And so if the plane malfunctioned and was crashing, everybody had to go down with it. So in 1911, a prominent French aviation club offered a large sum of money to anybody who could design a parachute for airplane passengers. A man named Franz Reichelt, who was a tailor in Paris, but who had always had a fascination with aviation, saw this reward in the paper and decided to take on this challenge. The design he came up with was not an external device like a backpack. Instead, it was a full suit with foldable bat wings that attached to the passenger's arms and connected all the way down to their ankles. Using his sewing know-how, he stitched up this totally bizarre looking prototype and he attached it to a dummy and threw it off of his apartment building. And amazingly, the dummy landed lightly on the ground. But when Franz, who significantly outweighed this dummy, put on his parachute suit and leapt off of the building himself, he did not touch the ground lightly. He smashed into the ground and broke his leg. But Franz was undeterred. He made dozens of changes to his suit, he added material, he subtracted material, and after a while, he felt like it was ready to be submitted to this French aviation club. But when the club members watched one of Franz's dummies wearing the suit come crashing into the ground because the canopy collapsed, they rejected his design. Franz assured them his design could work, they just needed to see it in action from a slightly higher altitude. The canopy needed more time to fully inflate. But the club members were not buying it, and they told Franz he should just give up on the design. Franz was offended and decided he would prove them wrong. So in 1911, Franz began petitioning to the city of Paris to allow him to test his design off of the Eiffel Tower. He thought if he jumped from one of their platforms, that would be high enough for his canopy to fully inflate, thereby showing that his design really did work. And so for a year, the city of Paris repeatedly rejected Franz every time he asked for the chance to do this. But in 1912, something changed and the city said, okay, you know what, Franz? You can test your parachute on the Eiffel Tower. But what the city didn't know, because Franz had intentionally kept it secret from them, was he didn't intend to launch a dummy off of the Eiffel Tower wearing his suit. He was going to put the parachute suit on and jump off these 17 stories himself. And so on February 4th of that year, Franz arrived at the tower, and standing around the base of it was a throng of people and journalists who had all read about this experiment in the newspaper. And so when Franz got out and promptly put on his parachute suit, the crowd gasped. They couldn't believe he was going to be the one jumping off of the tower. And none of Franz's friends or family knew he was going to be jumping off the tower himself. And so they pleaded with him not to do this. Throw a dummy off. You should not be jumping off. This is not going to work. Legend has it, Franz turned to one of his friends and he said, "You will see that my 72 kilos and my parachute will give your arguments the most decisive of denials." Then Franz promptly turned around and began walking up the stairs towards the platform. And with him was a journalist who brought a camera. Once Franz reached the platform, the journalist began filming him. And his video would capture Franz climbing up onto the railing and then hesitating. And he anxiously begins kind of rocking back and forth like he's debating whether he's really going to do this. And then at some point, he works up the courage and he jumps. And immediately his suit collapses and he slams into the ground, dying instantly. Another cameraman was on the ground and he filmed Franz's final jump. Here is a still shot of Franz right before impact. 45-year-old Florida man Mike Moylan suddenly shot up in bed and grabbed the sides of his head, wincing in pain. He had a blinding headache. He squinted across the room at the alarm clock. It was 4:30 in the morning on June 28, 2007. Mike got out of bed and tried to stand up, but he immediately got dizzy, so he sat back down again, took a couple of deep breaths, and then he stood up again, and this time he was steady on his feet. He walked across his bedroom into his bathroom where he opened the medicine cabinet, grabbed some painkillers, swallowed 3 of them, and then walked back into his bedroom. Before he laid down, down again, he noticed there was a dark spot on his pillow. Now, it was dark in his room, so he couldn't really tell what it was, and his wife April was fast asleep in bed with him, so he didn't want to flip the lights on and wake her up, but he had a feeling that that spot was likely blood. And so he ran his hands all over his head to see if there was blood coming off of him, and he found some on his right ear. And so he thought to himself, well, I guess my wife must have elbowed me in my sleep. That's why I'm bleeding, and that's why my head hurts. And so feeling content that that was what happened, he laid back down and waited for the meds to kick in so he could sleep. But after 30 minutes of complete restlessness, not only had the meds done nothing, it seemed like his headache was getting progressively worse and his ear continued to bleed. And suddenly Mike thought to himself, wait a minute, what if I have an aneurysm that's burst, and that's why there's blood leaking out of my ear onto the pillow? A brain aneurysm is the bulging or ballooning of a blood vessel in the brain, and if it ruptures, it can be fatal. And so now, feeling scared that he was dying, Mike woke up his wife April and told her, we gotta go to the hospital right away. And April, who's half asleep, seemed very confused, but eventually got the message, and they got up, they hopped in her car, and she drove them to the emergency room. As soon as they got there, doctors x-rayed Mike's head. Afterwards, when Mike and April were sitting in an exam room, a nurse walked in holding onto an x-ray image, and she held it up to the light and she pointed to a foreign object in Mike's skull, and she says, well, it looks like you got shot. Mike couldn't believe it, and neither could the nurse or any of the doctors. He should have been dead. April, who was apparently so overcome with emotions, ran out of the room, and Mike was quickly ushered into emergency surgery, where after a couple of hours, they were able to remove the bullet from his head. As Mike lay in his hospital bed recovering from the surgery with his wife next to him, the police showed up and began asking questions about what happened. And they initially just believed that a stray bullet must have entered the home and struck Mike in the side of his head. But after speaking to the couple, April revealed that she slept with a pistol underneath her pillow and that maybe it had fired accidentally. And then when they really dug into this and they asked her more questions about this gun underneath her pillow, her story began to unravel, and eventually she would confess that she had in fact tried to kill Mike and shot him while he was sleeping. She told police the reason she did it is she had recently destroyed one of the couple's successful businesses, but Mike had not found out about it yet. And so she decided she would kill him before he could find out. After her confession, Mike was crushed and felt like an idiot, but he would tell police that there were a couple of red flags about his wife that he noticed on the night he actually woke up with this headache. For one, when he told her, hey, I want to go to the hospital because I'm bleeding out of my ear, she apparently took a really long time getting dressed and acted overly confused about what was happening, well beyond the I'm just tired routine. And then when they got in the car and were driving to the hospital, she was driving impossibly slow and he was asking her to speed up and she just wouldn't. And so Mike realized now that what she was really doing was hoping if she just delayed long enough, he might die before they reached the hospital. Obviously, he did not. April was jailed on attempted murder charges, but just a year after being in prison, she was released on a plea deal. Here is the image of Mike's x-ray where they discovered he had a bullet in his head. One of the most insane jobs in the world is being a saturation diver for an oil and gas company. These highly specialized divers go down to extreme depths to do construction and demolition on underwater structures. The extreme pressure on their bodies from being so deep will cause some of the mixed gas they breathe to get trapped inside of their body. Now, this is harmless while it's happening, so while they're down at depth, this doesn't matter. But when they ascend, they have to do what's called decompression stops, where they basically stop in the water column at certain depths and just wait and allow these trapped gases to naturally come out of their body. Now, if they skip these decompression stops and just rush to the surface, those trapped gases will not leave their body and they will expand inside of them, causing a condition called decompression sickness or the bends, and it can be fatal. Now, these decompression stops get longer and longer the deeper you go, and in the case of saturation divers, they'll go as deep as 2,000 feet. And for reference, in order to safely ascend from 2,000 feet, it would take you about 33 hours. And so these oil and gas companies can't afford to have their divers taking 33 hours in between dives, and so they came up with a clever workaround. They built a pressurized chamber system on board ships and oil rigs where their divers would live in between their dives. And what this did was, by keeping their divers constantly under pressure, either literally underwater or in this system, the trapped gases inside of them didn't have a chance to expand, and so their divers couldn't get the bends. The divers would live inside of this incredibly cramped chamber for weeks at a time, getting transported to and from the seafloor inside of this small pressurized sphere that's called a dive bell that could detach from the chamber without totally depressurizing the whole system. At the end of these divers' multi-week shifts, they would do one long decompression stop inside of the chamber. And then when they were done, they'd step out of the chamber and they'd be fine again. In September of 2012, a 32-year-old saturation diver named Chris Lemons was on board a dive ship in the middle of the North Sea. He, along with 11 other divers, had just started a 4-week-long saturation shift. On the 12th of that month, Chris, along with 2 other divers named Dave and Duncan, were scheduled to perform routine maintenance on an oil platform 330 feet below the surface. The North Sea is notorious for terrible weather, but this day the weather was especially bad, and they considered not doing the dive, but ultimately they decided to do it anyways. As Chris, Dave, and Duncan put on their diving equipment and climbed from their living chamber through the tunnel into the dive bell, the captain of the ship navigated directly over this oil platform and then flipped on autopilot mode, which activated dynamic positioning. Now, dive ships rely heavily on dynamic positioning, which is really just this high-tech computer that makes sure, as soon as you turn it on, that the ship does not move from a particular spot in the water. So regardless of the swells and the wind, the ship stays steady. And this is really important when you have divers in the water, because the dive bell is connected to the ship and the divers are connected to the dive bell. And so if the ship is moving all over the place, so is the dive bell, and so are the divers, making it impossible for the divers to do their job. Once the captain had the dynamic positioning up and running, the 3 divers sealed the door of the dive bell behind them, and then the dive bell was detached from the chamber and then lowered through a hole in the middle of the ship into the ocean. Once the bell got down to 330 feet, Chris opened up a hatch on the bottom of the dive bell that led directly into the water. Now, because the pressure inside the bell matches the pressure outside the bell, water does not come in through this hole. Duncan was the bellman for the night, so he would not be going out and doing any diving. He would be staying in the bell to support Dave and Chris. And so he helped them get their big helmets on and connected their umbilical to each of them. Sat divers, when they're outside of the bell, are completely reliant on their umbilical. It's this long stretch of tubes and wires that are connected directly to their suit and to their helmet, and it provides air as well as heat and electricity to their lights, and it provides radio communication up to the people on the boat. Once Chris and Dave were all set up, they slipped through the hole at the bottom of the bell, which brought them down to this little platform that was suspended right below the bell, and from there they leapt off all the way down to the sea floor. Now, sat divers will say that leap from that platform is both amazing and terrifying, because once you leave the bell, it's completely pitch black all around you, so there's no reference point of how fast you're going or even how close to the ground you are. And so it feels like you're just sinking into this endless abyss before you crash into the ground. Once Chris and Dave did hit the ground, they stood up and began walking, and they were directed by the radio in their helmet which direction they needed to go to reach this oil platform. The oil platform was 11 meters tall, and it looked like a sort of pyramid of these big steel pipes. They climbed up the side until they reached their respective working area, and then they settled in to do their job, which they expected to take about 6 hours. At first, everything was going to plan, but about an hour into the job, something went terribly wrong on the surface. The dynamic positioning computer failed. Now, the captain immediately saw it and just expected the backup computer to kick in and take over. But in a terrible turn of luck, the backup computer also failed. And so very quickly, this huge dive ship began drifting in the rough seas, dragging with it the dive bell and the divers 330 feet below. While the captain struggled to try to fix the system and get it back online and get the ship back on station, another crew member hopped on the radio and called down to Dave and Chris, who were outside of the dive bell, and told them to abandon the structure and get back in the bell ASAP. And Chris and Dave could tell from the urgency in this person's voice that this was no drill, this was serious. Chris and Dave were both positioned on the south side of the structure about halfway up, and their umbilicals were running straight up the structure and then northward because the ship was drifting northward. So neither Chris nor Dave could go around the structure. They needed to go straight up before being able to climb their umbilicals back up to the bell. And so both men began climbing, but they could feel the tension on their umbilical was getting tighter and tighter, and Dave managed to get all the way to the top and he cleared the lip, and as soon as he was was on top, he started getting pulled away from the structure. And he looked to see if Chris was also getting pulled, and all he saw was Chris's umbilical, impossibly stretched, still draped over the south side, and he could not see Chris. And that's when Dave, Duncan, and all the people on the surface heard Chris come over the radio frantically saying he was stuck on the underwater structure. His umbilical had gotten wrapped around one of the pylons. And so through the radio, Chris asked Duncan to give him more slack. But Duncan said, "There is no more slack. We are completely tight here. You have to get it free." And Chris would say, "I can't unfree it. It keeps getting tighter and tighter. I can't get it off the pylon." And so Dave jumped down onto the platform and tried to pull himself over to Chris, but his own umbilical was getting pulled towards the dive bell, and so he could not help Chris. And so Dave knew he couldn't do anything, so he turned and began crawling up his umbilical towards the dive bell, and as he's climbing, he hears behind him this extremely loud explosion. It sounded like a shotgun going off, and what it was Chris's umbilical snapping under the tension. As soon as the umbilical snapped, it sent Chris flying backwards off the structure, falling towards the ocean floor. Without his umbilical, he wouldn't have had light, he wouldn't have had a radio to talk to anybody up on the boat, he wouldn't have had heat, and the water was just barely above freezing, and so he would have been very cold very fast, and he would not have had an air supply. Although he would have had 2 backup canisters on his back that would automatically turn on. However, they only gave him 5 or maybe 6 minutes of air. And so when Chris hit the ocean floor, it would have been eerily quiet and totally, completely pitch black. He stood up at some point and looked around him and didn't see anything, but knew he had to get back to the underwater structure. It was his only chance of anybody finding him again. And so he had to make the impossible decision of just choosing a direction and blindly walking, not having any idea what you're walking towards. Choose wrong and you might walk over a cliff. But at some point, Chris made up his mind and just began walking in a single direction, and miraculously, he walked into the underwater structure. He climbed up the side until he got to the top, which was a flat metal grate, and there he looked around and saw there was no dive bell, there was no sign of anything. It was just him. He was completely all alone. And he must have known at this point that he was running out of air. He probably had maybe 1 or 2 minutes left. And so he would have been acutely aware that even if they're looking for him, they're not going to find him in time. He's going to die. And at some point, breathing would have become extremely difficult until there was no more air, and then he would have passed out and keeled over. Back on the surface, the captain was desperately trying to use manual controls to pilot the ship back over where Chris was, but because of how rough the seas were, it was proving to be nearly impossible. As the captain struggled, other members of the crew launched a remote-controlled vehicle into the water to at least go down and try to find Chris. And so they decided they would just pilot straight to the underwater structure and begin looking around that area. And so for a few anxious minutes, the crew on board the ship watched the camera, which was the live feed coming from this underwater vehicle, as it went through totally dark water. And then at some point on the screen, the structure just appeared, and the vehicle, as it went up towards the top, it got a look at the very top of the structure. And on the screen, they saw Chris lying on his side, totally motionless. At this point, he had been without air for at least 20 minutes. In a last-ditch effort, the captain decided to completely power off the ship and its computer and just do a hard reset, something that you would never do, especially in rough seas, because if it doesn't come back on again, you are dead in the water. But when they turned it back on again, the ship came on and the computer system came back online, including the dynamic positioning computer. And so the captain immediately threw it on autopilot and the ship navigated right over where Chris's last position was. After Chris's umbilical had broken, Dave had managed to climb back up to the bell, and he was just standing underneath that platform right beneath it. And so when the ship got right back over Chris's position, Dave leapt off the platform, got to the seafloor, climbed up the structure, grabbed hold of Chris's body, and hauled him back up into the bell. Once Chris's body was inside the bell, Duncan, the bellman, removed Chris's helmet, and he saw that his face was blue and he was totally lifeless. But Duncan immediately just gave him mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. And after giving him 2 big breaths, Chris came back to life. He started gagging and coughing, and he's looking around wide-eyed, and Duncan and Dave are looking at him like, "You gotta be kidding me, you're supposed to be dead." And after about 30 seconds, the color in Chris's face had totally come back, and he was looking at Duncan and Dave and asked them, what happened? And Duncan and Dave didn't have an answer for him. And so instead, all 3 men just started laughing and hugging. They could not believe it. Once Chris was brought back up to the ship, the dive medic looked at him and concluded that nothing was wrong with him. He was perfectly fine, despite the fact he had been without an air supply for over 30 minutes. And 3 weeks after the incident, Chris was back down saturation diving again. Today, scientists don't know how Chris survived. The leading theory is that it was just so cold, it slowed his heart and his brain down, and that somehow kept him alive. But the reality is, his survival is a total mystery. Here is what the crew saw when their remote-controlled vehicle found Chris lying on top of that platform. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, the next time the like button asks for a phone charger, give them your broken one that only works when you bend the cord at a certain angle. 41-year-old Marvin Heemeyer purchased a plot of land in the small town of Granby, Colorado. There, for the next decade, he would run a muffler shop. Then, in the early 2000s, a cement company approached him and asked if they could buy a portion of his land so they could build a plant. And at first, Marvin was not really interested in the idea, but the cement company was offering a lot of money. And so Marvin came around to the idea, and after a long negotiation, Marvin and this company were about to sign a contract when Granby's zoning commission informed the cement company they didn't need to buy Marvin's property in order to build this plant. They could actually build it right next to Marvin's property. The cement company was thrilled. Marvin was furious. Not only was he losing a ton of money with this deal falling through, but also he used to use that plot of land that sat next to his property as a cut through between his house and his muffler shop. Marvin immediately began petitioning the town to try to stop the construction of this plant, but he was repeatedly rejected. And within a year, the plant was built right next to Marvin's property. A couple of years later, on the afternoon of June 4th, 2004, Granby residents heard a very loud sound that almost sounded like thunder coming from somewhere in the town. And so they ran outside to see what it was. When they looked down the road, they saw it. It was a fully armored bulldozer coming right down the center of town. The sides, the top, the back, the front, the whole thing was completely encased in steel sheets. And in some parts, the steel was over a foot thick. Traveling at 4 miles an hour, its treads were enormous, and as it went over the road, it was taking huge bites out of the ground. There was no way to tell who was actually driving this bulldozer because there were no windows. And in fact, the person who was in there had welded themselves inside, and they had installed cameras on the outside so they could see where they were going. Terrified residents ran for cover and began calling 911. Over the next 2 hours, this homemade assault vehicle would go on a rampage, destroying 13 buildings, starting with the cement plant. After that, it turned around and went straight through the town hall. It turned and went through a bank, and then it went through the police station, and then the local newspaper, and then it also went through a local hardware store and the house of the former mayor. The police tried to box the bulldozer in using their biggest vehicles, but it just easily pushed them aside. SWAT team showed up and began engaging this vehicle with their largest caliber armor-piercing rounds, but none of them went through it. Finally, one of the treads on the bulldozer got stuck in a basement, and it kind of tilted the machine on its side, and it couldn't go anywhere. And then very shortly after that, the engine finally died. It would take authorities 7 hours to finally cut through the armor of this killdozer. And when they looked inside, they found that Marvin was the one driving it, and he had taken his own life. Marvin had spent the past year and a half building up this bulldozer specifically so he could seek revenge on the zoning committee as well as other town officials that he felt screwed him. Marvin was the only fatality, but before he died, he caused over $7 million in damages. Here are some real images of Marvin's killdozer. On the evening of December 19th, 2016, 62-year-old Russian ambassador Andrei Karlov was ushered into a famous art museum in Turkey. There, Andrei was going to deliver a speech at the opening of an exhibition of Turkish photography that featured the Russian countryside. Andrei had been a Russian government employee for the past 40 years, spending much of his time in North Korea, but in 2013 he took this post as the ambassador to Turkey. Although he was a seasoned diplomat, he knew there was a lot riding on this visit. His appearance there was following several days of protests by Turks against Russian involvement in the Syrian civil war. Andrei was there to ease the strain in Turkish-Russian relations as officials from both countries met to broker a ceasefire in Syria. As Andrei made his way across the room, he had a lot of things on his mind, but one thing he wasn't concerned about was his own safety. The museum had state-of-the-art security cameras, and everyone who was going to be attending his speech had been carefully screened and vetted. Andrei was also protected by his own personal bodyguards that were these men in dark suits that fanned out around him as he stepped up to the microphone. The bodyguard who stood directly behind him was 22-year-old Mevlut Altuntaş. He was a Turkish native who for 2.5 years had served on an elite riot police unit, and over the past year, he had been asked 8 separate times to be on the personal security detail of the Turkish president. Andrei looked down at the podium at his notes, and then he looked up at the room that was filled with journalists and dignitaries, and he composed himself, he cleared his voice, and he began to speak. Behind him, Mevlut, the bodyguard, opened his jacket slightly and continued staring at the back of Andrei's head. And then in one swift motion, he drew a pistol and fired 3 shots into the ambassador's back. And then when the ambassador fell to the ground, Mevlut moved on top of him and fired 4 more shots, killing him. Guests started screaming and running for cover. Meanwhile, Mevlut pointed his finger into the sky and yelled, "Do not forget Aleppo, do not forget Syria." And then he began walking around the exhibit, smashing the pictures on the wall before Turkish security forces showed up. There was a gunfight and Mevlut was killed. It would turn out Mevlut was not a part of Andrei Karlov's security detail. He was actually off duty, but had used his police credentials to get into the exhibit hall. His exact motive for the assassination is unclear. Some think it was revenge for Russia's targeting of rebel-held areas in Aleppo. Others say the shooting was designed to disrupt warming relations between Turkey and Russia. But regardless of why it happened, what the world remembers from this event is the award-winning photograph that was taken of Mevlut immediately after he committed the attack. Here is that photo. In the fall of 2015, 21-year-old Otto Warmbier was a gifted student at the University of Virginia. He had a passion for seeing new and faraway places, and so one day when he was on campus and he saw an ad for a trip going to one of the most secretive places in the world, North Korea, he jumped at the opportunity to go. The tour was being run by a group called the Young Pioneers, whose slogan was, "We take you to places that your mother would rather you stayed away from." But they promised their tours were totally safe. Initially, Otto's parents were not too keen on the idea of their son going to North Korea, but when they saw how excited he was about going on this trip, they ultimately said, "Okay, we'll let you go." On December 29th, 2015, Otto met up with the other 10 members of this tour group at the airport. They all climbed inside of an old Soviet jet, and they took off for North Korea. 15 hours later, they arrived at Pyongyang International Airport, and as soon as they got off the plane, the North Korean border police came right up to them, confiscated their cameras, and then checked their phones for any subversive material. After a few tense minutes, they gave them their phones back and allowed them to leave. The group went straight to their hotel, and before they went inside, they noticed a clearly anti-American billboard right outside, and it made the group very uneasy because they were all American. But they collectively decided that this was just part of the experience and they shouldn't be worried or concerned about it. And before long, they had totally let their guard down and they were out enjoying the sights and sounds of the capital city. At one point, Otto and some others even got into a snowball fight with some North Korean children. By New Year's Eve, the group felt completely normal walking around North Korea. And so they headed to this huge party at Kim Il-sung Square with thousands of other North Koreans. And then after that was over, they headed back to their hotel and continued to drink. The hotel they were staying in was designed to entertain foreigners. In addition to their bar and 5 restaurants in the lobby, they had a massage parlor, a sauna, a bowling alley. I mean, this group was totally living it up. The following morning, which was the day of their departure from North Korea, Otto was one of the last people of the group to hand his passport to airport officials. And when he did, it seemed like they spent a lot of time looking at it and then looking at Otto and then talking to each other in Korean. And then at some point, 2 North Korean soldiers just appeared out of nowhere behind Otto, tapped him on the shoulder. Otto turned around and they grabbed him by the arm and led him away. The others from the group that saw this happen would say Otto didn't put up any resistance and didn't look scared. He just walked with them. Later, North Korea would release grainy CCTV footage taken from inside the hotel where Otto and the group was staying that showed this unidentifiable figure walking into a restricted area, pulling a poster off of the wall. And the North Koreans were saying that figure was Otto. After taking Otto from the airport, North Korean officials said they found the poster that had been stolen in Otto's possession. and they accused him of a very serious crime in North Korea, which is damaging or stealing any item that has the picture or name of the North Korean leader on it. Otto was sent to jail and the rest of his group was told to leave. 2 months later, on February 29th, the North Korean government released a video that showed Otto walking into a North Korean courtroom. His head is down and his hands are cuffed. They walk him into the center of the room and sit him down in front of this long table, and he's looking out to the sea of reporters and courtroom officials, and he proceeds to confess to his crime. The way he describes what he did is so bizarre that many people believe it was a forced confession scripted by his interrogators. Otto says he put on his quietest boots, the best for sneaking, and then snuck his way into the hotel where he stole the poster. He claimed a local Methodist church, a university's secret society, and the American administration all collectively pushed him to do this. He said his actions were intentionally designed to hurt the work ethic and motivation of the Korean people. And he also said he was impressed with the North Korean government's humanitarian treatment of himself, considering he was a severe criminal. And then after his nearly 2-minute long confession, he stands up and bows to the court, and then appears to break character and begs for forgiveness, and he's quickly ushered out. A month later, the North Korean court would convict Otto and sentence him to 15 years of hard labor. But after 17 months of intense political pressure, North Korea agreed to release Otto and send him back to the United States. Now, to this point, nobody had had a chance to communicate with Otto while he was in prison. And so when he was sent back, he was not the same Otto. He had suffered some unexplained head injury and was in a coma. When Otto's parents saw him for the first time, they barely recognized him. They said it looked like his lower teeth had been moved around with pliers, and they found a large scar on his foot that they didn't recognize. North Korea denied any intentional mistreatment of Otto. They said he fell into this coma after contracting botulism, which is a very rare form of food poisoning that can be deadly. Once Otto was back under American medical care, doctors did everything they could to try to get him out of this coma, but there was nothing they could do. He was in a persistent vegetative state, and he had already suffered severe brain damage. And so on June 19th, 2017, just 6 days after Otto was back in the United States, his parents made the heartbreaking decision to remove him from life support, and he died shortly thereafter. To this day, no one really knows what actually happened to Otto. Here is one of the final photos of Otto while he was still alive and healthy, taken right after his strange confession. He's holding back tears and begging for mercy, but mercy would not come. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please offer to house sit for the like button, and when you're there, split all of their 2-ply toilet paper into 1-ply.